You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra. How are you?
Doing good.
It's another day in paradise, right?
Yes, it is. Living the dream.
Yeah, it's going to be the end of September before we know it, so it's kind of crazy.
It is.
So today's topic is an interesting one, and it is toxic mold inspections and their limitations. Why do you think we're talking about this?
I think people have some assumptions about when they get a mold inspection that is not helpful to them and is certainly not helpful to the person doing the inspection.
Meaning we didn't answer all their questions?
Meaning, I think, people see inspections as it should tell me everything that's going on everywhere,
right,
without ever cutting a wall or, like removing a floor. There's just lots of variables, and an inspection will never tell you everything because you're not cutting floors and walls.
Exactly. It's what I call a non-invasive inspection. For the most part, even as an IEP, we're somewhat generalist. And what I mean by that is, yeah, you're a specialist in mold, but you're there to more or less do an initial general inspection. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think people don't understand that an inspection is kind of the equivalent in business of a balance sheet. A balance sheet is just a snapshot in time of the financials in that business on that day.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, the balance sheet could be different. Next month, next year. So people have to understand that an inspection is a snapshot of the IEP, indoor air quality, indoor IEQ.
Yeah,
it's a snapshot of the IAQ. In that moment, you could have your basement flood that night, and 2 days later, the inspection would be totally different.
Exactly. And, we could do the inspection right after a flood, and it could be really humid down there. And maybe, because it just flooded, the spores in the air are not as prevalent. Like, there's a lot of variables.
Mm-hmm. A lot. You could all of a sudden not be a person who has a lot of house plants, and by next summer you become a plant person, and now you have 20 plants, and it changes the dynamic.
Exactly. Yeah, you maybe have kids that splash in a tub, and when the IEP's there, it's all dry, but they see some problems, but they can't figure out why. And typically the homeowner's going to tell the IEP, well, yeah, my kids splash all the time. But I guess my point is let's say you just patched something or put a fresh coat of paint down or had the home just deep cleaned. You paid some cleaners come in and dust everything. If that's the case, we're seeing the home that's not in its normal conditions. Does that make sense?
It does, but it brings up something that I think renters tend to come across more than homeowners. And it's the fact that mold can be masked. Right.
Yeah.
So when you want to go rent a place, let's say a landlord knows there are mold issues. Can't they simply do certain things to like mask that there is a mold issue?
A fresh coat of paint.
Yep.
When I did home inspections all the time, I always said to my clients, and it's the same way for a mold inspector, but not as much. A fresh coat of paint is very troublesome.
It's a red flag.
And, sometimes when you're doing a home inspection, it's in a real estate transaction. So you kind of expect for a fresh coat of paint. But on the other hand, it's very troublesome. And, you would here's another red flag that's interesting with mold and home inspections, people that flip. And there are flippers out there that are really, really good. They're really concerned about mold and lead and all of that. And there's some that are just trying to make a buck.
Exactly.
And they're literally, I say it this way, it's probably not the proper way to say it, but they polish a turd.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's still a turd, but it's hard, and I think for our listeners that if they think about it from that aspect, that would make sense to them. But I think what's difficult, and I see it quite often, it goes back to what you said earlier. Well, they think they're hiring an IEP. This person's a professional. They're an expert. Well, even myself, who's done this for over 20 years, for our listener, if I went into your home and you didn't share everything with me and, the property conditions weren't what they normally are, even there's only so far I can go.
Absolutely.
And, I know it sounds like I'm blaming, the homeowner, and I'm not. It's just, I want our listeners to understand that we cannot see everything. Just because I'm a mold expert doesn't mean I can smell mold or I have x-ray vision. Like, there's only so much we can do too.
And an inspection is a single inspection. So you can't expect that it's going to answer all the things when it's one inspection done at one point in time.
Exactly. And, depending on the situation, if, let's just say, my client gets a hold of me, we go do an inspection, we don't see a whole lot of issues, we see a few issues, we do some testing, no major red flags, it's frustrating for them when I say, hey, I think we're going to have to do more investigations, more inspections. And I'm not doing that to try to make more money. I'm actually doing it to save them money.
Exactly.
Because naturally, people think, well, we can just do remediation and everything's going to be fine. We kind of talked about that last week, but that's not how that works. Like, I want to make sure, because I am a certified inspector, and I'm also a certified mold remediation contractor. I want to make sure on the remediation side, my client understands that just because we came in and removed the mold doesn't mean all their problems are gone.
Exactly. And I guess for a lot of people who are listening to this, they want to understand what can they expect from an inspection, because I'm sure there are people out there who have hired people to do mold inspections and they did a horrible job, and people who've hired people to do mold inspections and they've done a great job. What are some of the signs from your perspective that the mold inspection that's being done isn't good? I mean, I would assume if somebody shows up to your house and they don't have a ladder and they don't have flashlights and they don't have certain tools and they're just going to look around and walk around, that's probably a red flag.
Yeah. I mean, if they're not taking pictures, they don't have any equipment, I can only speak for what obviously we do. But on the other hand, for our listeners, your IEP should have several pieces of equipment that are specialized pieces of equipment, which is not a flashlight, not a hammer and a screwdriver. Things like an infrared camera, a hygrometer, which is a humidity gauge, a moisture detector. If they don't have those pieces of equipment, and even for an IEP, you should have a low volume air pump that we use to do air sampling. If they come in and they do their air testings, the agar dish, the Petri dishes, like you said, they don't have a ladder, they don't have a flashlight, I'd be very concerned. And that's why for our listeners, how do you avoid that? Well, call the inspector. and just ask them a few questions. Once again, we're humans. We're all different. Every inspector's not going to do their inspections how I do them. But on the other hand, they should have the basic knowledge. They should know what mold and mycotoxins are. They should have an infrared camera, the hygrometer, humidity gauge, and moisture meter. Those are very important pieces of equipment. Like I use a bore scope. Once again, I don't expect every inspector to have what I have. But on the other hand, I mean, like you said, I can only imagine if, your inspector rolls up in a Corvette and they don't have any ladders or
anything.
They're dressed all nice, like
and they're just looking around.
Yeah.
They're like, interesting. Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
Show me where you think mold is.
Exactly.
Is that a good? I mean, the other part of a mold inspection is on average, and I know every person is different on how they do inspections, but I noticed that your mold inspections are long. I mean, they're not 2 hours.
No, it's an all-day affair.
Yeah. So on average, what should somebody expect in terms of the number of hours somebody would be doing a mold inspection?
So once again, and I know I say this all the time, but it's reality. It really depends. Like I remember, and this has been years ago, there was a time where I would only do mold testing. We did away with that because I felt like it was a disservice to my clients that for the most part, I was not doing an inspection, so I didn't really know. I could interpret the lab results, but that's as far as I could go. So you have to have an inspection with testing. To answer your question, if you're hiring a professional and they're only going to do air testing, well, yeah, that's only an hour. They're going to do a little bit of an inspection. When I say little bit, like just to get the ladder out and crawl up on the roof and do the roof inspections, a good 45 minutes.
Yep.
Just to do the crawl space is another 45 minutes. And I guess my point is, and to answer your question, a thorough inspection should not be less than 3 hours.
And that's, I think, what people really need to know. They
Yeah.
need to, because then when they're calling and saying, hey, can you come to wherever to come do a mold inspection for me? They can ask to vet the possible mold inspector.
Yeah.
They can say, how long on average do your mold inspections take? And if they hear 3 hours, great. If they hear an hour and a half, they should be concerned.
Yeah. And honestly, in my opinion, 3 hours is too short. But I understand that we all do things differently. One thing for our listeners, though, keep this in mind. Your inspector is there to do a job. And if you don't let them do their job, the quality of the inspection will not be what it normally would be.
So in other words, if you're stopping the mold inspector every 5 minutes to ask them an educational question and they're actually sitting and spending more time answering your questions than actually doing the mold inspection, then you can expect what you're going to get from that.
Yeah. And I know it's difficult, especially, a lot of our clients we're traveling for. If they're going to ask me a bunch of questions, then they're getting a consultation. They're not really getting an inspection. And I politely tell people, just so you know, I'll answer whatever questions you have. Write them down as I'm doing the inspection. Let me do my thing. When I'm done, I'll grab you. We'll go over everything. We'll decide what types of testing can be done or should be done. Then I'll answer your questions. But if you keep stopping me, I'm losing focus on what I'm trying to do. And, I really dealt with this a lot doing home inspections. I mean, it was typically, the husband would pull me over here and say, hey, can you look at this? Then the wife would come over and she'd be like, can you look at that? And you would finally have to say to them, like, hey, I'm trying to do my job. And it's nothing personal, but we have a job to do.
Absolutely. And it's important for the clients to know that there will be time at the end to discuss. There will be time at the end to sit down, but the inspection still needs to get done. Do you ever recommend to people that they prepare for a mold inspection in a certain way? And the reason why I ask this is because oftentimes people have small children around and they have dogs and they have other animals. And it's like, so the mold inspector gets on site and then you've got a 5 and a 3-year-old that are like, what are you doing? And can I play? Can I help you? And so
that's why I have flashlights I give the kids.
That could be a distraction
notebooks.
Too.
No, there is typically before an inspection, I have a pre-inspection letter.
Okay.
That just kind of goes over everything. It's, when I did home inspections, I had a leave behind letter that I would leave for the homeowners. But to answer your question, yeah, I try to prepare them. I would assume most people know, like, if you have an aggressive dog, if it's in the garage or wherever, I'll inspect everything else, and then when I'm ready to take care of the garage, then they'll go get their dog and move their dog. But it is very distracting, and it's a good question. For our listeners that have young children, they love following me around.
Exactly.
And as much as I love kids, it distracts me.
Yeah.
And my clients are always like, so-and-so, leave him alone, let Steve do his job. That's why, like I said, the notebooks that we put in the mold box, we bought we had notebooks made and flashlights. Well, that's what I'll give to the kids to kind of distract them.
Yeah. And then they probably still come back around because kids are curious and they want to do it. But when you're thinking about, I think it's important for people to understand what happens during an inspection. Like, part of it is prepping for it so the inspection can happen and go well. But when the inspection is actually being done, what does it entail for people?
As far as what we're inspecting?
Yeah, like yes, it's minimum, I would say, of 3 hours to your point earlier, but what can somebody expect to happen in general? I mean, everybody's different, but what can people expect to happen during a mold inspection?
So for me, I typically start with the exterior.
Okay.
I get up on the roof, do the outside inspections. Once I'm done outside, I typically go, if there is a crawl space, I do the crawl space. Then I'll do the attic. Sometimes I wait for the attic, just depends on the type of attic and the size of the home, because I get in my monkey suit and put my mask on and all that to go up in the attic. Once I'm done with that, then we start going room by room. Typically, I'll start like in the mechanical room where the water heater furnace is. We kick on the furnace. We check the condensate drain pipe, inspect the water heater, move to the laundry room. But every room is part of the inspection.
Oh, wow.
And because we're looking for any moisture concerns when it comes to a mold inspection, we're looking for water stains, cracking. I have an infrared camera, so we check the ceiling, see if we can find any missing insulation. If we find water stains, then I got to go get my moisture meter, check the moisture in it. Like, it's every room. So to answer your question, like, we run the dishwasher, we run all the sinks. Like, it's pretty extensive if I'm doing it.
Absolutely. So I guess that this brings me to a different question, but when you're saying it should be at least 3 hours for a mold inspection, I think that's probably what on an average home that's somewhere between 1,300 square feet and like 3,000 square feet. What about in a much bigger home, 7,000, 10,000, 20,000 square feet? Like, is it really going to be only 3 hours if you're doing a mold inspection on a 20,000 square foot mansion?
No, that should be 2 or 3 days.
Okay.
At least.
I think that's an important point to bring up because there are, and I think you did say this in one of your books on how to build, a mold resistant home?
Building a mold resistant home.
Yes. Even when you're building a brand new home, so you think big, beautiful mansion, there could still be mold issues. And so there will be cases where you have people in these massive homes wanting a mold inspection and they need a realistic preview that it's not a one-day thing.
Right. And, once again, that's the information I try to gather prior to the scheduling the inspection. Because like I said, a lot of our clients are out of town. So, it's not your inspection $700. I have to figure in mileage and lodging and all of that. But if we're not told the size of the home or the condition, that's another thing too. It could be a 10,000 square foot home with minimal issues. That would go much quicker than even a 2,000 square foot home that has a bunch of issues. So the condition of the home has a lot to do with it too.
Does the age of the home factor into it? Because I think of homes that were built on the East Coast in the 1800s or 1880 something, 19 something. And they all have hardwood floors and really sturdy foundations. Does the age of the home impact the inspection time or?
It just depends on the condition.
Okay.
If it's
So age and condition are different, is what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, because a home that's been well maintained, whether it's 20 years old or 2 years old, is way different than a home that wasn't.
Okay.
Like, we deal with homes that were just in foreclosure or are in foreclosure. It could be new construction. It could be, like you said, a home built in the 1800s. It's hard. And out west, we don't have a whole lot of buildings like that.
No.
But yes, the age of the home is an important factor. When I think of the age of the home, I'm more concerned about lead, asbestos, stuff like that.
Okay, so really it's like every person needs to go into a mold inspection knowing that the factors connected to the age, condition, size of the home go into deep consideration of how long it's going to take.
Yeah, and I would, for our listeners that are like, okay, so let's say we live in Colorado or Idaho or Wyoming or Utah, and we want Steve to come do an inspection. Let's say it's an out-of-town inspection, which most of them are. If it's more than 3,000 square feet, we probably are going to have to talk to the client and say, hey, this might be a day and a half inspection. And I guess my point is for the most part, for our listeners, if you have a massive 5,000, 6,000 square foot home, it probably is going to take at least one day. And when I say probably, once again, a lot of it just depends on, what we're there for. If it's a remediation issue, they already know they need remediation. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time in the other areas of the home. We still inspect everything. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
But for our listeners, if your home is larger than 3,000, 4,000 square feet, it's not going to probably get done in one day. And if that's all you want to pay for, you've got to understand there's only so much I can do in one day.
Absolutely. Now, what about daily habits of people in the home? I think that also goes back to the fact that the mold inspection is a snapshot. So talk about the daily habits and limitations of a mold inspection.
So I kind of touched on it a little bit earlier. If you have kids that are splashing in the tub all the time and they do nightly baths, so, I'm there 12, 14 hours after they took a bath. If you don't tell me that and we don't see any signs of that going on, you can't expect me to just assume or know that I know what the habits are. Does that make sense?
It does. Is it better to have somebody do a mold inspection when the household is in the thick of those habits?
It's not really
it
possible.
Doesn't okay. So like you have a child that's on the swim team and they have this terrible habit during swim season of bringing their wet trunks and their wet things and just plopping it on the floor. Would you say it's better to do a mold inspection, sort of a snapshot during swim season, or it doesn't matter?
Well, it would. It would be better during swim season.
Okay.
But you bring up something that's in the title, the limitation of the inspection. So let's say it's not swim season and we go do the inspection. You don't tell me that your 15-year-old throws their wet swimming suit over here in the corner of their bedroom on top of the carpet, which has pad below it. It would look a lot different with my infrared camera during swim season versus not swim season.
Well, and I say that because I just think about if you were traveling to Florida to do a mold inspection, do you want to do it during hurricane season?
Well, no.
No, I'm just thinking because, again, winter in Wyoming, for example, when there's massive snow load, or do you want to do it in the spring after all of the snow load is gone to see does timing matter, I guess is my real question.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're asking, and it's a bit complex. Mm-hmm. And so our listeners are probably like, well, just answer. It really depends on what we're dealing with. And it's not, my best answer is it's not an easy answer to give because I don't know a lot of important information. Like, is this for remediation? Is this one person in the home sick? We can't find any mold. We've done this testing. Like, that's not an easy question to answer. It really isn't. And, we did just this winter, we did an inspection up in Montana, and the day of the inspection, the high was like -30.
It was cold.
It was a cold trip.
It was brutally cold.
And so, and I remember my client, we were dealing with snow in Wyoming. Like, we kind of barely got there. They were closing roads behind us. And she's like, well, we can reschedule for next week. Well, my stuff's scheduled out in a way that it snowballs. Mm-hmm. And my point is, when I was dealing with that client, it was more or less like, this is just part of the job.
No, absolutely. But then it brings me to another question then, because you're saying it is complex. Should people look at doing mold inspections for their home the way they do an annual physical? Is this something they should do on a yearly basis? If it's just a snapshot, which it is, how often should people be doing mold inspections?
I usually say every other year.
Okay.
Now, traditional air testing, which is the cheapest way to test, you can hire a mold inspector to do that every year.
Okay. Now, then here's another question, because I know people are going to listen to this episode and they're going to write down, okay, a hygrometer, moisture meter. They're going to be like, maybe I can go to Home Depot and I can get all these things and I can do it myself. What do you think of people who want to do mold inspections on their own?
Well, I actually have a course on Udemy that's DIY mold inspection. But for the most part, once again, that would, in my opinion, be like the nurse who assists the orthopedic for surgeries thinking she's qualified or he's qualified to do a surgery.
Okay.
Now, I know that's a way different analogy because our listeners are like, well, yeah, but that nurse sees it all the time. My point is you want somebody that knows what they're doing and what they're looking for. And I'm not saying our listeners aren't smart enough. It's just something where we do it all the time. So my analogy with the nurse probably wasn't the best one, but I do this all the time. And for the most part, every inspection, I can pretty much know where I'm going to find the mold. And our listeners wouldn't. And it's because I've done it for so long and for so many years. And, once again, I have the proper equipment. I do it all the time.
Yeah. So even just getting the equipment doesn't make you qualified.
Yeah. Even getting certified doesn't make you...
To know what you're looking for, to know what you're seeing, to know what it means, and to know what to do about what it means.
Yeah, and I'm sure our listeners have seen these memes or whatever on social media. But for me, you're paying for my experience and my knowledge. It's the analogy I usually see is, you hire a mechanic, he's going to charge you $500 to fix whatever he's done in an hour, but you could hire a new mechanic and it takes him 7 hours. And at the end of the day, you pretty much have to pay the same amount. That's kind of how, I know that's not the best analogy either, but for me, you're paying for my expertise.
Absolutely. So what is your call to action for people?
Just understand one inspection is not going to answer all your questions.
It's just a snapshot.
Yeah. And that's all it is. It's not abnormal for us to say, hey, we're going to have to do more. Don't expect your IEP to know everything.
There you go.
So we have consultations available on the website. You want to explain that?
Yes, you can book a virtual mold consult. You can also book a virtual property assessment. We call them VPAs. Go to cnccontractorservices.com and you can learn more and sign up and do a consult online.
All right. Well, there you heard it. There was a pretty informative one. That was almost a half hour. So I appreciate all you listeners. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.